Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I think I'm about ready. Am I ready? I'm ready. The end of the era. Well, it seemed to come upon the world quite suddenly. Nobody expected it, especially the great shipping companies. They thought at the end of the war that they would reinstate their ships. They'd replace the ones that had been damaged and sunk during the war, and happy days were here again. But the world had moved on. Life was different. The war had shown how aircraft could be built for long-distance flying that could carry very heavy loads. The heavy bombers proved that. And at the end of the war, airlines started to fly further and further. American Boeing Company produced some very, very fine new long-distance passenger planes. The same in England. The Avro made some wonderful airliners out of old bombers. So people started to fly. They started to fly long distance. It was expensive. It took a long time. They were propeller-driven planes. They were bumpy, noisy, but they were there. And they were beginning to take over. The shipping companies didn't realize this. They didn't see the writing on the wall. And they proceeded to have what they thought would be a new golden age of shipping, passenger shipping, on the oceans of the world. It didn't go out like switching off a light. Similar to that. We all know what it's like to have a candle. A candle burns, it has light, and it burns reasonably brightly until it gets almost at the very end. Then suddenly it gutters, brighter than ever, and dies. That is exactly what happened with the great age of ocean liners. They died. The entire infrastructure of ocean liner travel imploded upon itself. It wasn't just the ships. It was the booking offices and the ports. Everything started to crumble. But before it did, there were some wonderful ships built to replace some other wonderful ships that had been and gone. Shipping companies. As some of you may recognize some of these names. The British companies, there were many of them. There was the Blue Star Line, the Bibby, the Ben Line, the Blue Funnel, which was Alfred Holt, Canadian Pacific, Furness Withy, Fife's Banana Boats, the Anchor Line, Cunard Steamship Company, or Cunard White Star as it was then, the British India, Union Castle Line, Elder Dempster, P&O, the Ellerman Lines, the Orient Line, New Zealand Shipping Company, Shaw Savill and Albion, Pacific Steam Navigation Company, the Royal Mail Company, Headline of Ulster, the Manchester liners going up the Manchester Ship Canal, and the Booth Line, lovely little ships going all the way up the Amazon to Manaus. The Europeans also reinstated their great passenger ships. Holland America, Norwegian America, the French Line, the Polish Ocean Line, the Italia Line, Messageries Maritimes of France, the Swedish America, Moore McCormick of America, North German Lloyd, the Grace Line, the Hamburg America, United States Line, Ward Line, American President Lines, Matson Line, and Fred Olson. He was still there. So what was the philosophy? All these companies finally folded. They became purely passenger-less. They used to carry, some of them carried 12 passengers, but they eventually all went into containerization. And they became cargo ships rather than passenger liners. In 1939, a Cunard White Star had built an intermediate ship. Lovely little ship. Well, she wasn't little. She was 35,000 tons. But she was a ship that was built to sort of supplement the great queens. The idea was Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth would have a weekly service to New York from Southampton. And an intermediate company, or an intermediate ship, which had been the second Mauretania, 35,000 tons, would have taken up the slack. The last of the White Star Line was still sailing wonderfully. They redid her, they rebuilt her, they put a new interior into her, and she was wonderful. The Britannic, the last White Star Line ever to sail with White Star colors. And the idea was, and Cunard really weren't all that delighted to have one ship. They liked pairs. It was easier to plan, it was easier to plan routes and timetables if there were pairs. Similar size, similar speed, similar class. So with Mauretania, they had decided before the war that they were going to build a sister ship, another ship of some 35,000 tons. They didn't have a chance to do it. But at the end of the war, the great Queen Elizabeth, that had gone on her maiden voyage painted grey and went all through the war carrying hundreds of thousands of troops, finally was built as she had been intended, and she went into service with her sister, Queen Mary. And Mauretania went back on the Atlantic. And the idea still struck. We need a sister to Mauretania. So they decided to plan another ship of 35,000 tons, and it was going swimmingly. But of course, after the war, Britain was in a very parlous state. We had no money. We had spent the treasure of an empire fighting an enemy. And we had won. Well, sort of. Who wins? But we had won. And we were poor. We needed money, we needed cash, we needed hard currency, we needed American dollars. So what do we do to get American dollars? Everything that we built and created in Britain after the war was for export. You couldn't buy nylon stockings in England, you couldn't buy a car in England for years, you couldn't buy cashmere sweaters. All went to America. And of course, the great transatlantic liners were all bringing in dollars by American tourists starting to come to Europe again. So they decided to build a sister to Mauretania. During the course of the planning, they had a change of heart. Do we actually need another purely transatlantic liner? Well, no, we don't. Why don't we build the most luxurious cruise ship in the world, planned for Americans to go world cruising? And in the off-season, when she isn't cruising, she could be a two-class liner and supplement the transatlantic service. So that's what they decided to do. And they built a beauty. She was called Coronia. Very unusual. They made her so that she would stand out in any harbor of the world and everybody would know what that ship was. She was painted in 5 shades of green. Cool. She wasn't completely air-conditioned at that time. Eventually she was, but her restaurant and some of her top suites were air-conditioned, but she wasn't. So a green ship in the tropics was a cool ship. A black-hulled ship gets hot. She had, of course, the Cunard White Star colors, or basically the Cunard colors, of orange-red funnel with a black top and 3 black stripes. They possibly could have given her 2 funnels, as Mauretania had, but they decided no. They would give her the largest funnel ever seen on an ocean liner. And so it was. They built Coronia. She was known by her crew and her passengers as the Green Goddess. She rolled a lot. Her crew, well, without that much reverence, nicknamed her the Vomit Comet. She was built at John Brown's in Clydebank, number 635, 715 feet by 91 feet, 34,000 tons, and she would be able to carry 800, 900 passengers in 2 classes across the Atlantic, first and cabin class. On her world cruises, this ship was intended to carry only 400 first-class passengers. It was going to be a great day for the nation. We were finally building passenger ships, luxury ships again. We didn't need warships. We were reinstating our prominence on the Atlantic and on all the seas. P&O were building some wonderful ships after the war. They eventually had the beautiful Arcadia and the Iberia. The Orient Line were building a new class of ship, also of 28,000 tons. The O-class, Orcades and Orsova. But this lovely Coronia was to be something special. And if you're going to build something special that hopefully would also reflect the nation, who are we going to have to name her and become her godmother? And they thought, and they didn't have to think that long, because the idea was in front of their very noses. We could have a royal send-off. The great Queen Mary had been launched by Her Majesty Queen Mary. The great Queen Elizabeth had been launched by Queen Elizabeth. Why don't we use Queen Elizabeth's daughter, King George VI's daughter, Princess Elizabeth, to name our new ship? Very fortuitous, because just a few months before, Princess Elizabeth had become engaged to her spanking new blonde bombshell from Greece, Prince Philip. We will ask them both to come and name this ship, which they did. She was launched by Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip on October the 30th, 1947. She was a wow. As she went to New York, she picked up passengers. You couldn't do part of a cruise on Coronia. Fly cruises hadn't started then. You either did the whole cruise or nothing. And her world voyages became legendary. What was she like inside? What a wonderful idea. Getting there is half the fun. Well, in my opinion, getting there by sea is all the fun. Coronia had a very strange mast. It was like a tripod, only one. She had an outdoor swimming pool and this enormous funnel, and she was recognized everywhere she went in the world. These are some of the interiors getting built. She was very much a 1930s ship, even though she was built in the 40s. A lot of wood, very Cunard in feel, very luxurious, very expensive. And here, the main lounge on Coronia, very similar to that on the Queen Elizabeth, even though Queen Elizabeth was more than twice the size. And over the fireplace, this lovely double portrait of Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip. Of course, we all know today Princess Elizabeth is Queen Elizabeth II of the United Kingdom, a very old lady and still strutting her stuff. I don't know how she has the strength to do it. And she is still married to her boyfriend, the lovely Prince Philip, now Duke of Edinburgh. What was the ship like inside? Well, elegant, of course. Gold leaf, Chinese carpets, lot of leather furniture. She sailed very happily around the world, and I don't even know what the cost was. But each January, Caronia would sail from New York with 400 special picked multi-millionaire Americans to go around the world in luxury. She even had one lady who lived on the Caronia for 14 years. Her name was Clara Macbeth. She never got off. The only time she got off, literally, she was turfed off. When Caronia had to go into dry dock in Southampton, Mrs. Macbeth was taken off the ship, brought to New York on one of the Queens at no cost, and there she would stay in New York in a hotel until it was time for her to return to her suite on the Caronia. 14 years she lived on this ship. Caronia had two equally splendid restaurants, the Sandringham and the Balmoral. Both restaurants were open for world cruising. Both restaurants held all the passengers at one sitting. They would sit over 250 each. But on her transatlantic travels, one of them became the first class, the second one became the cabin class restaurant. There was hardly any difference. The suites and the cabins were almost the same. The prices were slightly less in cabin class. And this is what a suite, bedroom of a suite would look like. In those days, ships rolled alarmingly. A Caronia had no stabilizers. And these beds, I don't know if any of you ever remember, you had beds with bunk boards that were wooden sides that prevented you from rolling out of bed during the night. Somebody once asked me, why were there two pianos in that room with covers on them? But they were beds. They were luxurious. The rooms were luxurious. The parties aboard were unbelievable. One American millionaire had tons of Saharan sand brought onto the ship as it was going through the Suez Canal, and she had an Arabian Nights party around the swimming pool that had sand spread all around it. And you had to come dressed in exotic clothes with all your jewels. And boy, did they have jewels. Caronia itself lasted until July 1968. Then she was sold. She was sold to another company because she was becoming too expensive and people were not sailing as much as they want, and they renamed her the Caribia. They sailed on one cruise from New York. It was a complete failure. The ship couldn't pay its bills. She was arrested in New York and finally sold and towed away to be broken up. She didn't manage to get to her breakers as she literally broke away from her tug outside Guam in a typhoon, and there the lovely Caronia died. Sadly, by this time she was in terrible state, and it was like a great singer or a great opera star suddenly ending up in Skid Row. She is there, and a friend of mine who is with me in this trip has dived upon the wreck of the Caronia. But of course, it wasn't the end of what was going to happen on the Atlantic. The Americans suddenly decided that they needed a very large ocean liner. In fact, they didn't. What they needed was a very large troop ship. America had rented or chartered the great ocean liners of Europe, especially Cunard during the war. And as I showed you yesterday, Queen Mary, Queen Elizabeth was filled with American troops to go from America to Europe for the war, 16,000, 17,000. But the Queens had a big problem. They were too big, and the Queens could not get through the Panama Canal. The Americans wanted a troop ship of their own, capable of going through the Panama Canal and capable of carrying 15,000 troops if necessary. And we're talking about an age in the late 40s, early 50s, when war was not eradicated, as everybody had hoped and thought. We were at war again. And we had the Vietnam War came up, and the Korean War came up, and there was talk of possibly a nuclear war. So America decided that they would build what was in fact a huge troop ship. But they brought her out as a passenger liner. 53,000 tons, designed by Francis Gibb, William Francis Gibb, a brilliant American naval architect. 53,000 tons, not quite as big as the Queen's, 990 feet long, not as long as the Queen's, and 101 feet wide. At that time, 101 feet wide was the widest that you could get a ship through the Panama Canal. It was known as Panamax. She was to be extremely fast, and they gave her the name United States. She was virtually completely built from steel, glass, and aluminium. She was to be completely fireproof. They were terrified that their ships would go on fire. The European ships, they were lucky. So many of them didn't go on fire, but many of them did. And they had conflagrations that was dreadful because their interiors were virtually wood. But the United States was built. She won the Blue Ribbon of the Atlantic as the fastest ship in the world. But on her trials, which were secret, eventually worked out that forward this ship could touch 43 knots. Unbelievable. She could do 25 knots in reverse. And this ship was without doubt a racer. And when she finally went onto the Atlantic with passengers, and she carried 870 first class, 508 cabin class, and 550 tourist class, or 15,000 troops. That never happened. She was never used as a troop ship. She won the Blue Ribbon of the Atlantic from Ambrose Lightship, New York, to Bishop's Rock in England in 3 days, 10 hours and 40 minutes. Hardly worth unpacking for 3 days and 10 hours. Unbelievable. She won the Blue Ribbon from the Queen Mary. And as the United States swept down the channel and entered the channel towards Southampton, she met the outgoing champion, Queen Mary. Queen Mary sent a message: "Welcome to the fastest ship in the world." The answer came back, "Thank you, but you will always be the Queen." Very polite ships are. Aluminium, huge funnels, 2 huge funnels. Lifeboats were all aluminium, or as the Americans call it, aluminum. Completely fireproof, no wood whatsoever, except the Steinway Piano Company flatly refused to build concert grand pianos out of aluminium. The Americans said, "But you did it before. You had an aluminium piano on the airship Hindenburg." And they said, "Yes, but never again." It was like trying to play a baked bean tin. So they relinquished the idea, and they allowed him to have 3 wood Steinways aboard their ship. The chef said, "I'm not going to cut my meat on an aluminium cutting board." And they said, "Okay, we'll give you a wooden one." The orchestra leader came into the act, and he says, "I'm not conducting my orchestra with an aluminium baton." And they said, "Yes, you will," and so he did. But all the ship inside was created from non-flammable materials. Even the chair covers were not flammable. Nothing was made of wood. Even the paintings on the ship were done on aluminium. And there she is. The Americans absolutely adored it. This was their finest achievement. This was better than the great queens. This was American know-how and razzmatazz. This was America afloat. And thousands of people used to watch this ship leave. Thousands would be there to greet her coming home. And this is some of her interiors. Not leather, it's what was known as naugahyde. Low ceilings. Only one room was more than 1 deck in height. If you're more than 1 deck in height, you're getting rid of floor space. You need all the floor space possible for a troop ship. All these chairs, lovely. The design was good. She was like a Manhattan nightclub. And there it is, a Manhattan nightclub. Beautifully lit, concealed lighting, aluminium, polished, elegant people. Of course, anybody who was anybody wanted to travel on the latest, the fastest, the most modern ship in the world in the 1950s, including the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. Duchess of Windsor, I think one of the directors of the United States Lines was a cousin, and they created a deal that if she would leave, and if they would leave Cunard and come to the United States Lines would give them the very top royal suite at the very lowest tourist class rate. So they did. And they traveled every year across the Atlantic on the United States in this wonderful suite with 28 pieces of luggage going to their apartment in the Waldorf Astoria. The only high room was the first-class restaurant. And even the sculpture was all done from spun fiberglass. Service on American ships is wonderful, was wonderful. The food is fabulous. Maybe your waiter may not say, "Good morning, sir." He may come up with, "What would you like, bud?" But the service was excellent and the food was fabulous. She carried a lot of military between America and Germany because they still had a big contingent of an army in Germany in the 1950s. United States was withdrawn from service and laid up in November 1969. She had been owned by the United States Lines, which was a government agency. She had been built, she had been operated by the American government, and it was losing too much money. They decided they'd rather put money into the new jet airliners that were being built in America by the Boeing company. So she was withdrawn from service and laid up in 1969 at Norfolk, Virginia. In June 1993, this ship was laid up. She was put in what they call mothballs. Everything was taken out of her except her engines. It was all sold, all the furniture was sold, and there she sat, until finally she was brought to Turkey in 1993 to be stripped of her asbestos. Obviously, if she's going to be a fireproof ship, she was up to her gunnels in asbestos, poison. You couldn't do it in America, you couldn't do it. So it went to Turkey. The Turks decided, "I'm not going to do it." So she was towed into the Ukraine, left up to the Russians to get rid of the asbestos, which they did. When it was all done, she was empty, she was towed back to America, and there she sits. She's there. Sad, sad, sad sight. The cinema. Speed. Oh, she crossed the Atlantic so fast that the paint was sloughed off her waterline. She used to have to be repainted after every few voyages. And here she is today. The lovely United States. America couldn't give one hoot about this ship. She just sits there and rots for years and years and decades and decades. All sorts of ideas have come up. Shipping companies have decided, yes, we will buy her, we will convert her, we'll make her into a cruise ship, one of the most famous ships in the world. Doesn't happen. Other people come up and say, well, why don't we paint her, do her up, bring her into New York as a great hotel and a great museum. No, she still sits there. Sadly, sadly. The Americans have the Queen Mary in Long Beach, California. They think they built the Queens, but United States is non-event. She won the last blue ribbon of the Atlantic, and she was given the Hales Trophy, a huge silver and gilt trophy with portraits of all the winners around the globe. The only company that did not accept it was Cunard. and Queen Mary's name is not on this trophy at all. And the Hales Trophy was held by the United States Lines for many, many years, until an entrepreneur from Australia decided he was going to go and try to get the blue ribbon of the Atlantic, which he did with a wave-piercing ferry boat, a very fast one. And he crossed the Atlantic faster than the United States. Got the idea of winning the blue ribbon. The blue ribbon was supposed to be a prize for a passenger ship with passengers, the fastest between America and Europe. Nevertheless, this little speedboat crossed the Atlantic, and there was a law case. They wanted the trophy, and eventually they got it. No, not fair. They don't deserve it. The Italians started to build new ships after the war. Beautiful ships. The Cristoforo Colombo, the Augustus, and the Andrea Doria. Well, you may remember Andrea Doria had one of the greatest shipwrecks after the war. She was in collision with a Swedish ship called the Stockholm, and Andrea Doria sank off New York. But they then built two other very large 50,000 tonners, the Raphael and the Michelangelo. Gorgeous ships. Strange funnels, they look like waste paper baskets. But eventually they withdrew from their services because it was all dying around them, and the ships were sold to the Shah of Persia. The Shah of Persia had them as barracks for their troops. And there they were in a harbor in Iran. And at that time, there was a war between Iraq and Iran. And we backed Iran. No, we didn't. We backed Iraq. Yes. And, well, Saddam Hussein sent his planes to Iran, and they sank these two ships. So another two tragic war victims. P&O. P&O started to build ships again after the war. Lovely ships. This is the Himalaya. Ships to go to Australia and to do cruising. Lovely. And as did the Orient Line. This is the Oronsay. All their ships had names beginning with O. They were virtually allies of P&O. P&O owned the majority of shares until finally they amalgamated as one company called P&O Orient Line. The Arcadia of 1954, the first ship that I ever went on a cruise with my parents, first class. We were very posh, and I loved it. I fell in love with P&O in 1954 because of this lovely ship. And here we have the Southern Cross. Southern Cross was built in Belfast. I watched her being built. I watched her being launched, and she was launched by the Queen. The first time a reigning monarch had launched a ship. Usually it had been the wives of the reigning monarchs, but Elizabeth II in Belfast named the Southern Cross for the Shaw Savile line, and virtually in a thank you for having been given or loaned the Gothic for her world tour after her coronation. The Gothic was a royal yacht until the ships got to the Mediterranean, and there they were met by the brand new royal yacht Britannia. I can talk and talk and talk and talk. Every bit of my talks can lead into another talk. Come back again when I have more time. I've got 14 talks I can give you. Then we have this lovely lady, Princess Alexandra, the Queen's cousin, who was asked to launch and name the Orient Line's biggest ship to be built up to that time. A lovely ship, a very beautiful ship. And there, that wonderful hull of this ship, which was called Oriana. And the great Oriana was designed and built to be the largest and fastest ship to go to Australia. She won what was known at that time as the Golden Cockerel, not a blue ribbon. She was built by Vickers Armstrong in 1959 at Barrow. Geared steam turbines, 2 classes, 42,000 tons, a wonderful ship. Why Oriana? Well, it was built for the Orient Line. All their ships had names beginning with O, and here we have a new Queen Elizabeth on the throne. Shakespeare's name for Elizabeth I was Gloriana, the Great Oriana. So the Orient Line decided, as a homage to the new queen, they would give her the name Oriana. And there she is. She actually only had one funnel. It looks as if she had two, slightly quirky in design, but lovely. And this ship eventually, after sailing for many years, and she went to Australia, she became a cruise ship, and then she went to Japan, and then from Japan she went to China. And she was in China and had an accident. She was tied up, and she had an accident, and she virtually capsized and sank in China. The strangest thing is that the second Oriana, at the moment on her final voyage, has been sold to the Chinese, and they ended up then with both Orianas. I am going at the weekend. I'm flying up to Norway to pick Oriana to do her last 6 days as a P&O ship. I was on her maiden voyage 24 years ago. So her last port will be Belfast. I was born and brought up in Belfast, and I saw many ships launched in Belfast. So it's like kismet. The circle is being squared. I was on the maiden voyage of Oriana. I will be in her last voyage of Oriana, and her last port will be my city of my birth, which I haven't been to for a long, long time. But this is the lovely Oriana as she originally was built, with a yellow hull, white upper works. Wonderful. I wish all the ships had been painted like that. And here she is at the end of her maiden voyage at the Circular Quay in Sydney. Interiors, modern, lovely. Brian O'Rourke designed them. Very modern, very luxurious, 2 classes. And she had a running mate. Her running mate was built for P&O in Belfast. It was called Canberra. Many of you may have remembered Canberra. Canberra was virtually replaced by the second Oriana. Canberra was 45,000 tons, built in Belfast, the same size, similar to Titanic, and Canberra bankrupted Harland and Wolff. They couldn't afford literally to complete her at the price, and they forced themselves to, and they ran out of money, but Canberra was a wonderful ship. There she is at her launching. Dame Patty Menzies launched this ship, wife of the Prime Minister of Australia. I was there. I was underneath that bulbous bow when she was launched. And there she is, part of Belfast disappearing. Her interiors, except this room, which had stayed for her whole life, was the cricketer's bar, a wonderful room. The rest of it I thought was pretty horrible. And here was her crow's nest. Very early 1960s, very spindly, very modern, very naff actually. And she had 2 lovely restaurants and a beautiful room with bentwood furniture. And of course she went to the Falklands, and she came home to a hero's welcome. Then she went on her final voyage in 1997. I was on that. I've seen more ships come and go, and I'm still here. And we blew up balloons, and it was the balloon cruise, and happy, happy event. It was wonderful. And there she finally went to Pakistan. So heavy was she, they couldn't get her up to the beach, and they broke her up in situ. Sad, sad sight. Her bell is in Australia. And probably the last of the great ocean liners to be built was the Rotterdam for the Holland America line. 35,000 feet. Went on world cruises, competed with the Coronia very well. She competed with Coronia. She lasted for many years, and nothing changed within the center of this ship. If anything was damaged, it was replaced exactly as it was. A carpet was worn, it was completely rewoven, and the carpet was set. Just wonderful. There it is, the beautiful Rotterdam, with her ceiling in Dutch tiles on the ceiling. Gorgeous. 1960s, this was a great example of good interiors of that period, which was never noted for wonderful interiors. The Dutch do have lovely taste. The Rotterdam exists. The Rotterdam is in Rotterdam. You can go and you can board, you can stay on it, you can eat on it, you can have lovely cabins and rooms, and you can see what a great transatlantic liner was like. So she is there, Queen Mary is in California. QE2 is in Dubai. So some of the great iconic ships still exist, but not as passenger ships. And here we have the beautiful France being launched. Gorgeous looking ship. The last great liner to be built for France. And this is her first class restaurant. 63,000 tons, mostly tourist class, not that many first class, but excellent. And there she is. Finally, she was withdrawn from service. She was bought, I think I told you the other day, she became the Norway, and she became a huge cruise ship. And one of my great favorites, the Kungsholm, a Swedish ship designed to be transatlantic, didn't last that long. She finally was bought by P&O. She was renamed Sea Princess. They messed her up by keeping one funnel and taking the other away, which was a great mistake, but nevertheless, and that's what they did to her. From a swan, they made an ugly duckling, but inside she was gorgeous. And she eventually had a name change, and she was called the Victoria, and it was one of my favorites, only a 28,000-tonner transatlantic liner and a beautiful little cruise ship. All interiors were Swedish, even had proper deck chairs on a promenade deck. And then we start a new era. Mardi Gras, Carnival. Carnival decided, I think Ted Arison was his name, he used to bring oranges into America on old V-class American warships or war-produced ships. And he made money, and he decided he wanted to go into the cruising business. So he bought a couple of old ships from Canadian Pacific, the Empress of Britain, the Empress of England, and he started cruising. He called one the Mardi Gras, he called the other one the Carnival, then he decided to call his name the Carnival, and then they started to expand, build more ships, buy more companies, and he ended up virtually being the king of cruising in the world. Huge organization Carnival is today. They own Cunard, they own P&O, they own Princess, they own Costa, they own Uncle John Cobley and all, an incredible organization. And they also, of course, bought the QE2, and finally they decided they wanted the biggest ocean liner in the world, so they built the Queen Mary 2. And I'm virtually at the end, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not going to hold you up for too long. But before you go, I want to read you a poem. A poem that I have in my book. By the way, if anybody, I'm surprised, if anybody wants to have a look at my book, there's a copy in the library upstairs. I think you can take it out, but you may think it's worth looking at. It's called Liners in Art. Wonderful. So that's that. Now, affinity. Why do I love ships? Well, I really don't know. Maybe it's something psychological, I don't know. But I used to watch them being built in Belfast, and then I started sailing on them. And I've had over 30 years talking on great ships. I still love it. I still love being at sea. I still love being on a ship. A ship is an incredible invention of man. As a ship will seek shelter in its harbor, so too will you. It nuzzles the dock, its presence is felt, it becomes as one with its space and settles into familiarity. It takes in its life's blood, moving slowly and restlessly till the time is right. Then it is gone. Suddenly it seems as if it were no more and never was. You too are as real and as fleeting as a ship, touching and leaving the harbors of your own lives with nothing to prove you are there, other than the reality of your being as remembered by others. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. In 2 days' time, I do the story of a legend. I do the story of Titanic. And I thank you for coming. Enjoy today, enjoy tomorrow, enjoy everything. Bye-bye.